makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Mainstream economists are in full meltdown mode after the New York Times published an interview with Stephanie Kelton, who is one of the main proponents of modern monetary theory, a controversial new economics idea that most mainstream economists think is akin to a quack cancer cure or snake oil, or, there's been plenty of other uh, insults to people who have been advocating MMT, as it's often called. Um, First of all, I want to say I'm completely agnostic about MMT. I have not studied it enough to have a definitive position on it. I am somewhat sympathetic to some of its criticism of traditional macro models, which I think the empirical evidence does not always show that these models are grounded in reality, like many macro models. Case in point, what led to the 2008 crisis. But for the moment, I will be very clear that I am not advocating MMT as a policy objective. If I was the Minister of Finance of Mexico, or the President of Mexico, I don't think I would implement MMT, or at least the full version of MMT that people like Kelton propose. Having said that, like I said, I would be very receptive to some of the criticism that it makes, and I would definitely agree that perhaps its most fundamental idea, that deficits don't really matter that much in a country like the US, is absolutely true. So true that Alan Greenspan himself is on record saying that the US will never default on its debt because it can print it money. So the idea here is that uh, the idea that deficits and debts have fear-mongered a lot of economists and a lot of economic policymakers into enacting policies that fundamentally hurt working people, like fiscal austerity, for example, without there really being any evidence that they serve the purpose that they intend. The idea here is that if you have if you run consistent deficits, if you have too much debt, uh, GDP growth will suffer. And there is as yet no convincing evidence that this is the case, empirical evidence. And a reminder that one of the papers that supposedly found that evidence, written by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, was thoroughly debunked in what is probably the most humiliating episode of the economics profession over the last decade. Completely debunked. So let's see who has it's the usual suspects that have, and when I say the usual suspects, because these are also the people who have had also an intellectual meltdown over the proposal to have targeted price controls to solve the inflation crisis. And I made a video about this a bit earlier. So who are these usual suspects? Well, for starters, of course, Larry Summers, whose only purpose in life right now seems to trash any idea that is even remotely critical of the orthodoxy. So he wrote a tweet: I am sorry to see the New York Times taking MMT seriously as an intellectual movement. It is the equivalent of publicizing fad diets, quack cancer cures, or creationist theories. That's funny that he has these words to say about just MMT and not all the other things that the New York Times has endorsed over the years, whether it be, I don't know, Iraq wars, or a lot of the same free marketeering policies that Lawrence Summers has supported over the years. So, yeah, I am. This He's also been very critical of price controls, and he's also been very wrong. So Lawrence Summers right now thinks he has been proven right about inflation because he has been fear mongering about inflation over the past year, ever since the COVID stimulus bill was being debated. And he doesn't seem to understand that the current inflation crisis has nothing to do with the COVID stimulus bill. But the irony is that the article that he quotes is cites MMT as doing a victory lap, when that's exactly what Larry Summers has been doing ever since inflation started spiking, despite him being wrong about the causes of that inflation. For the record, for example, Mexico right now also has very high inflation, despite the fact that Mexico never passed a massive COVID stimulus bill. We've had no stimulus whatsoever in this country. Um, yeah, so this is just ridiculous. Anyway, let's look at. Oh, of course, I couldn't talk about Larry Summers and his legacy without this infamous time cover, the Committee to Save the World, where he and Alan Greenspan and former Treasury Secretary, was it Robert Rubin? I forget his first name. The three marketeers that were going to save the world. Remember how that ended. Anyway, there's also, putting it into the context of the freakout that they had over price inflation, which was also involved Paul Krugman, who had this tweet that he later deleted and later apologized because he said, "I am not a free market zealot, but this is truly stupid." And this was regarding an article published by Isabella Weber, a German economist who recently wrote a very interesting book on China, which I have yet to read. But yeah, God forbid you take a policy that sounds remotely unorthodox. And remember, people like Weber have been arguing for price controls that are targeted on certain particular items that are driving inflation. For those of you who didn't see my previous video on inflation, when you hear inflation is at 7%, that doesn't mean that everything has risen at 7%. What it actually means is that most prices have remained the same. Some have perhaps even fallen, but there have been a few items that have risen in price exorbitantly and are leading the consumer price index, which is basically a weighted index of different goods and services. That is what is driving inflation. So the idea of, and she makes it very clear in this article, again, Krugman clearly just read the headline, is not that price control should be set on every item of the economy, as if it was a planned economy, but rather that it should be targeted on specific sectors that are driving inflation. And again, the evidence is mixed. You can make your own opinion on this, but I think in exceptional circumstances, we should be very receptive to exceptional solutions. So to just discard this off the bat really just tells you that, in fact, he is a free market zealot, because he can't think in any other way that isn't, the traditional macro orthodoxy. And again, Krugman is supposedly one of the good ones. He's a liberal, anti-Republican hero. So if this is what the good guys look like, imagine what the bad guys look like. Anyway, someone noticed the similarities between the criticism of Isabella Weber and the criticism of Stephanie Kelton. Male economists are freaking out over a New York Times profile. So a handful of prominent male economists, including Larry Summers, have had this meltdown. They're freaking out. I really don't want to get into too much assuming that this is a misogynistic critique. There is some element, especially from Summers, who is a well-known misogynist. If you don't believe me, check out his scandal at Harvard. But yeah, there is an incredible arrogance that I see among economists, especially male economists. Economics is a very sexist profession. It really is. If you don't believe me, look at the list of Nobel Prize winners. There's no other Nobel Prize that has been so dominated by men as economics. So yeah, there is some of this. I don't want to say that this is the only reason that they're complaining, but there is an element of misogyny here, and certainly, perhaps not so much in in the original comments that people like Summers made or people like Noah Smith, who I'm going to discuss in a bit. But if you actually look at the comments, like the pylons that you see from people also criticizing these people, yeah, it does have a very sexist tinge to it, and it is mostly male economists responding. So, econ Twitter is very male centered as well. So those pylons definitely have an aura of misogyny in them, even if like the critique is not in itself misogynist. So let's. I don't want to go through the whole article. You can read it yourself if you want. I don't think it's a particularly well written article, and I don't think it really explains much about MMT, which I think is an issue. I think people who are receptive to MMT would want to be explained thoroughly what it entails, and you see a lot of MMT proposals on deficit doesn't matter, things like that, which these are arguments that are not exclusive to MMT. You know, standard economic theory can make the case that deficits don't matter. But the specifics of what MMT differs from macro theory, which are very controversial, I'm going to mention some of them. But like I said, I haven't read enough to be convinced. So I'm leaving it up there, and I'm at the moment agnostic and will remain so because I do not like to take positions on issues, especially complex issues like politics and economics, when I am not fully convinced that they are true. I don't want to just go with the flow and just say, oh, well, this is, a lefty supported theory that criticizes mainstream economics. Therefore, it must be good. No, that's a bullshit way of thinking anything. And I'm not going to fall into that trap. And I also I hope that people who watch this don't fall into that trap and just be like, oh, any criticism is makes it good. No, that's not. You're falling into the Jimmy Dore land of anything that isn't mainstream. It must be good because it's not mainstream. So anyway, now next up was Noah Smith, known on Twitter as No Opinion. I really dislike this guy. I really, really do. I think he's absolutely obnoxious and has a shitload of really awful takes. But he's something of a celebrity in like the econ Twitter sphere, for reasons that I find inexplicable. But then he wrote an article that was like even longer than the original. Like this is how demented these people are. Like they see an article, they're gonna write on their Substacks like an article that's 3 times as big, just because they got triggered that badly. So I'm gonna pick up on some of the points that he made. Please consult macroeconomists before writing about MMT. So he calls this a puff piece that didn't have any criticism of it. That's weird because when the New York Times publishes anything that is glossing over orthodox views, I don't hear Noah Smith ever arguing, oh, wait, they didn't have a Marxist. When the New York Times writes a pro free trade piece or a pro free market piece, does Noah Smith write a 3,000 word Substack article saying, oh, they didn't include a Marxist or a progressive economist in there? No, he doesn't. That's the game that all these charlatans play. When an unorthodox view is published, they complain that dissenting voices were not included to make a valid critique there. So it becomes a puff piece. But then every other puff piece that they publish that doesn't get criticized, that's okay with them. So that's the first red flag here. What else? So one of his critiques is that, and this is not just Noah Smith's critique. There's a lot of people who are critical of MMT who complain that MMT doesn't have a model behind it. And again, I haven't read much of the literature on MMT to know if there actually are any major mathematical models. But again, this is a very strange critique as well, because a lot of strands of economics aren't based on models. So I'll give you one very notable example of a strand of economics that has become incredibly popular over the past decade or two, and isn't fundamentally based on any unified formal mathematical model. And that's behavioral economics, because as it turns out, it's really damn hard to make models out of the psychological behavior of people, which economics has tried very badly to do throughout its entire or its recent existence. And precisely behavioral model economics exists to point out that that way of modeling human behavior is fundamentally flawed. But behavioral economics doesn't offer an alternative model to it. Behavioral economics still runs under basic macro assumptions. Uh, so it's more of a critique of how macro or micro models rather look at human behavior. You know, this idea of utility maximizing rational individuals, assumptions that are in almost every economic model you will find. So behavioral economics offers a critique of that, but doesn't offer an alternative model in which to construct this model of the economy. So that's never been a critique of behavioral economics. No one said, oh, we're gonna, it's not a valid critique of the orthodoxy because it doesn't have a mathematical model behind it. Another strand of economics that also isn't fundamentally based on math is institutional economics, which I'm quite a big fan of. Institutional economics has a lot of insight on, historical development, things like that, how economic institutions work. And again, this is not based on a unified model that is alternative to the one that is presented in a macro textbook. So, or micro textbook. This is very strange that, and no one has said that institutional economics is bullshit just because it doesn't have a model. So there's two aspects here to understand. And I'm not quite sure what Noah Smith is really wants to see from MMT. Does he want like a formal model that explains how MMT works? Because you would have struggled to find like a convincing model from people like Friedman back when he was pushing monetarism as well. Or does he want empirical evidence? Because I'm quite sure that you will find a lot of empirical evidence that supports some of the more controversial claims made by MMT. And I'm going to show some of these. So what happens when you don't have a model, but you start seeing a lot of empirical evidence that seems to prove that the model that you are criticizing is flawed? Well, then you start taking it seriously. And maybe you'll build up the model as you go along. So again, this is very silly, and I just don't think this is like, he's caught in like the physics envy of economists. That, no, you have to have a model. If not, it's bullshit. This is wrong. This is wrong. So, what else? So he's so disingenuous. This is what I hate. What I absolutely hate about him. He's such a fucking liar in some of the things that he writes. So, for example, he points out that the MMT star is fading just because Google search shows that it's actually been falling from a peak in 2019 or so. So interest surged in 2019 when writers of the original Green New Deal used MMT as their justification for not finding ways to pay for all the new spending. This is false. So some of them did mention MMT, but if you recall the debates over the Green New Deal back then, the fundamental argument given by AOC and others was that it was going to pay itself through economic growth. That some of them would have brought up MMT as like, oh, there's also a theory known as MMT that suggests that it's not going to, destroy the economy is another thing. But the fundamental argument on how the Green New Deal was going to pay for itself was through growth. I'm surprised. Well, this is deliberate. This is deliberate way of framing this. Yeah. Including some hardcore socialists, then fell as econ writers from across the political spectrum, including some hardcore socialists closely aligned to the Bernie Sanders movement, rose up to caution the world against the idea. Sanders had probably already parted ways with Kelton, and after this fracas, AOC and her allies stopped championing this idea as well. So this Sanders had already, this makes it sound like he parted ways with Kelton because they disagreed on MMT. Dude, Kelton was an economic advisor to the Sanders campaign. By late 2019, the Sanders agenda had already been written, had already been framed. And by early 2020, Bernie was out of the race. So why would Kelton, who is an academic, need to be with Bernie all this time? This is, again, very, very misleading, deliberately misleading framing. And that's why I think Noah Smith is full of shit. After this fracas, AOC and her allies stopped championing the idea as well. Yeah, the Green New Deal, again, it's sort of, it's not being currently debated because there's been other issues that are being debated, like infrastructure, etc. Have you heard any advocate of the infrastructure deal use MMT? No, because also, like I said, here's my issue with the critics of MMT. They must assume that anyone who isn't like 100% in favor of MMT thinks it's bullshit. And that doesn't mean that just because you are sympathetic to an idea or sympathetic to some of its claims, that means that you're going to frame your entire agenda on MMT. No. It just means take this idea seriously, or give it a bit more respect than you're willing to give it. That's all I think people would ask of these critics, and that's what I would ask for them as someone who is not in bed with MMT, but who definitely believes that, like I said earlier, in exceptional circumstances, we should be open to exceptional ideas. Yeah. Then he goes into Larry Summers territory, saying the rise in inflation was exacerbated by supply chain inefficiencies and disruption, but it was almost certainly propelled to some extent by COVID relief spending and the Fed's extremely loose monetary policy. Again, why is he repeating this claim that why didn't inflation rise when Trump passed his even bigger COVID spending bill and when monetary policy was just as loose? This is, again, how many countries have not enacted these massive COVID spending relief bills, and which have had perhaps less loose monetary policy than the US has, and they've still experienced inflation. Again, I gave the example of Mexico. Mexico also has over 7% inflation right now. Mexico, unlike the US, did not pass a COVID relief bill. We've given fuck all to people. Despite being a leftist government, which is why I fucking hate it. And two, Mexico isn't near or remotely near like the near zero bound of the monetary policy rate. We're not at zero. We were never at zero. We've had leeway to go up and down, and Mexico has started tightening monetary policy now for various months. So these conditions that didn't exist in the US, and yet we still have inflation. So it's clearly not an issue of this spending. Anyway, so he continues to just call it, a political meme and things like that. And here is, again, this is another. I'm struck by how MMT has actually had relative little influence on the political system. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, for example, both proposed paying for their spending proposals. Again, you don't have to be in bed with MMT to think, just take it seriously. It's really that easy. This is like a gotcha that just isn't. This is crazy. Also, I would say there's a political dimension to why you wouldn't run on MMT. First of all, because it's kind of a fringe ideology that a lot of people aren't aware of. So on that account, I probably think you can, if you were a politician that was favorable to MMT, you would probably just apply it after you came to power. Remember that Margaret Thatcher, she did not run on privatizing anything, and then started immediately privatizing as soon as she came to power. Why? Because she knew it was incredibly unpopular at the time. She was hoping that once it would be applied, people would be favorable to it. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Because people warmed up to the idea of privatized public services only after they were privatized. Still a mistake in most cases, I would say. But I'm just talking about what the British public, how they responded to the idea of privatization. Uh, Same could be with MMT. You don't have to run on an MMT platform. Uh, yeah, what else? And then he quotes like random people as like, oh, see, I read her book and then it was wrong, says this guy with yeah, 422 follower. Yeah, that is the proof that Noah Smith needs that MMT is bullshit. Quoting some guy with 400 followers on Twitter. Uh, and then he ends up with again proof. This is a guy who I should. So I copied an exchange here that he had with Matt Stoller. Matt Stoller does some very good work on antitrust issues and monopolies, etc., and is very critical of mainstream economics. And Matt Stoller replies, I am no MMTer, but I'm struck by how the basic critique by no opinion of MMT, they always claim they are right, apply to failed mainstream models of economics. None of them got the financial crisis or free trade or shortages. It's all garbage, all of it. And then he responds, I spent several years criticizing those people and those models. Indeed, that is what I first became known for writing about. This is again, so to summarize who Noah Smith is, he's like the Ezra Klein of econ Twitter. And by this I mean that he offers this very sort of edgy but at the margins critique of the orthodoxy, but which fundamentally doesn't deviate from it. In fact, he's thoroughly opposed to any major deviation of the orthodoxy. He's basically just defending the status quo with these edgy critiques. And why is it? Most of his followers are centrists. That's the bulk of his fan base. Centrists who oh, I'm edgy just because, I criticize the models a bit. Ends up being like Paul Krugman, like, I'm not a free market zealot, but actually you are. You are, because you cannot deviate from any orthodoxy. And that's exactly what Noah Smith does. He never deviates. He offers no structural critique of anything in economics. So yeah, why do I mention this? Because he ends criticizing also the price control thing, which he's now describing as the really scary threat to U.S. macroeconomic policy. Boo hoo! God forbid we might have a price control on like half dozen items. Jesus Christ! And then he does what every shit-brained centrist and right-wing economist does, and that is mention Venezuela. Dude, when you mention Venezuela in like a serious discussion of any economics issue, you've lost the fucking debate, okay? This is like the Hitler fallacy, the economics version of the Hitler fallacy. Debunk everything by invoking Venezuela and not ever understanding exactly the context of Venezuela. Yeah. And then, like, the Biden administration hasn't gone for price controls yet, but is attempted to blame inflation on powerful companies. Oh no, this is the guy who's like the edgy critic of standard macro models, complaining that someone is blaming inflation on powerful companies, which, again, please watch my previous video where I explain how the concentration of industries in the U.S. has increased enormously over the past couple of years, pretty much like the last 2 decades since the 90s. And that is reason to believe that inflation is to some extent being caused by that. That is the case that Matt Stoller has been making for a while now. But he doesn't take that seriously. Of course not. It's unorthodox. Yeah. So here's some of the so if we're going to talk about Venezuela, the idea here is Print money. This is the standard conventional view of money, and that is inflation is caused by printing money. Milton Friedman, again famously in 1963, said, "Inflation is and always has been an entirely monetary phenomenon." Now, MMT argues the exact opposite. MMT argues that inflation really is an issue of resource constraint. When you have an economy that is running at full employment, with all its resources being utilized, then and only then can monetary policy or other overheating cause inflation. That is kind of the case that MMT is making. Now, most standard, I guess, most people think that printing money causes inflation just by printing money. That is utter bullshit. Here's the Venezuela case. If, as I guess people like Noah Smith would be inclined to argue, printing money is what causes inflation, then this graph makes absolutely no sense. Here is the monetary aggregates of Venezuela, M2, which is broadly speaking the indicator that is of the money supply, and that's the blue line. And then you have inflation. Now these are series that have basically Venezuela stopped publishing an official inflation forecast, an inflation number from 2016 onwards. I remember because I was covering Venezuela in my previous job back then. You had to use the unofficial rates that was published by non-government endorsed sources. What is wrong with this picture, dare I ask? That inflation started spiking way before the monetary supply started spiking. How much? Like 2 years before. That is 2 years of a lag between the two. So was inflation entirely a monetary phenomenon? I don't think it was. What also happened in 2014? The oil crisis. The oil crisis that created huge uncertainty among holders of Venezuelan currency over the ability of the government to eventually support the value of that currency. So inflation, in fact, turns out to be, in many cases, or at least inflation shocks like this, turns out to be primarily a psychological phenomenon. A belief among, and especially once we discuss hyperinflation, that's also the case. When people stop believing that the government can honor the value, can honor the value of money, or back it up, because these are all fiat currencies which are ultimately backed up by government promises. So the moment that people lose trust in government, that's when it spiked. But it did not spike because they printed more money. Want to see the exact opposite case? Here's the USA, which since the 2008 crisis has expanded the Fed's balance sheet by 3.5 trillion up to, this was before COVID, by the way. So the peak around here, the mid part of this chart, that was when the Fed balance sheet was about 4.5 trillion, whereas it was only less than 1 trillion before the crisis. So they printed 3.5 trillion in money during this time. And what happened to inflation? Absolutely nothing. That is the red line. So I've rebased both figures to start at 2008 equals 100. So they're starting from the same position. That is how much the Fed's balance sheet has risen since 2008, starting from 100, whereas the red line is inflation, how it has started from 100. So please tell me with a straight face that printing money causes inflation. Second point, and this is one of the other controversial points about MMT. And this is one that, while I'm going to show you some evidence to support it, I guess we would have to see kind of on aggregate, if this actually would happen in a situation in which a government applied MMT. And that is the idea. Again, this goes completely against the economic orthodoxy, which the economic orthodoxy is if you well, let me summarize. MMT basically says that monetary policy is as close to useless. That interest rates changes do not have impacts on other economic variables, such as, for example, investment. So this makes no sense under the standard economics explanation. The idea is, well, if you have higher interest rates, then you are less likely to invest, less likely to spend. So that is why raising interest rates is usually the monetary policy response to an overheating economy. So what does reality tell us? Well, here's a Fed study from 2014. You can see it says Fed. Well, these are staff writers staff members from the Fed, but yeah, Federal Reserve Board. Insensitivity of investment to interest rates, evidence from a survey of CFOs. A fundamental tenet of investment theory and traditional theory of monetary policy transmission is that investment expenditures by businesses are negatively affected by interest rates. Yet a large body of empirical research offered mixed evidence, at best, for a substantial interest rate effect on investment. In this paper, we examine the sensitivity using yada, yada, yada. So we find that most firms claim to be quite insensitive to decreases in interest rates and only mildly more responsive to interest rate increases. Most CFOs cited ample cash or the low-level interest rates are explanations for their own insensitivity. In a situation where firms are flush with cash, as they are now, then what does this say about the transmission of monetary policy into the real economy? Again, this is not me. This is the Fed saying exactly what MMT is arguing. Again, I would love to see some more kind of an example of this being applied. But as it is, there's just then there's the so there was an exchange between Krugman and Stephanie Kelton a few years back, and Krugman just makes some very silly arguments here on like he just can't he can't stop imagining that monetary policy is like the way to impact aggregate demand. And so he mentions the natural rate of the natural interest rate, which would provide full employment here. He's using something that in macro is called the ISLM curve, which was developed by a very famous economist called John Hicks, who subsequently, this is very ironic because the ISLM curve is taught in every macro course, in every economics program in the entire world, despite the fact that John Hicks himself said that it shouldn't be taught, or rather it shouldn't be used for policy making. So Krugman here is using the ISLM model to prove that that there would be so that interest rates would lead to eventually reaching the full employment. So he's saying that in this curve, the IS3 curve, let's say this is like the standard state of the economy, and he's not including the LM curve, which is so the IS curve is basically the real economy, whereas the LM curve is the financial economy. We can forget about the financial economy for a bit. So this curve, what it basically says is, the lower if you lower your interest rates, more GDP, which is standard monetary theory. Point C is the rate at which is the interest rate at which you would get full employment. So if there is some shock to IS3, so to the IS curve. So it goes down here, in which the way to maintain full employment. So this would be some kind of demand shock. The way to maintain full employment would be to drop the interest rate. And the only point in which you have an issue here is when you reach the lower zero bound, the near zero bound, sorry, of the interest rate, which is a situation which most advanced economies have found itself in. But he still fundamentally he misunderstands this idea that there is an interest rate at which you would get to full employment, and I'm not quite sure people can actually estimate this, and he admits it so himself. Where is he? So yeah, first he suggests that the neutral natural interest rate, which is defined as the interest rate consistent with full employment given everything else, does not exist. Here's why it doesn't exist. Because you can't find it. It's a theoretical construct from macro models, but it doesn't necessarily exist. What does she mean by that? I think she means that it's hard to determine, or maybe that it's unstable, which are defensible claims. But the analysis I've just given doesn't depend on the natural rate being either easily estimated or stable over time. In fact, I never mentioned the natural rate. All we need is that the central bank be able to move rates and that these rates affect overall spending. You mean this spending? Or how about let's talk about interest rates and employment. Here's another study which estimated the impact of interest rates on the labor market in not just one country but various ones. And here is the conclusion. According to the magnitude of these effects appears to be small. According to the results from the baseline regressions, after 2 years, a 2 percentage point increase in the real interest rate is followed by a rise in the unemployment rate of 0.15 percentage points among the total labor force. Wow, that's an amazing effect. So let's say the inverse. I don't know if he's describing the inverse here, but if that is how little, how weak the transmission between interest rates and the labor market is, and also how this one shows how weak the transmission rates are between the interest rates and investment. What does this say about this chart? What does this say about this imaginary natural interest rate? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I mean, it's a theoretical construct, but it doesn't exist. It's like saying I have a model in which there should be a second moon, but I've never seen the second moon. Well, it's there. We can't measure it, but it's there. The model says it's there. And no one has ever found that moon using every single instrument available to us to discover celestial objects. And we just haven't found that moon. What does this say? Is the problem that we haven't been able to find the moon? Or is the problem a model that assumes that there is a second moon? I would think the problem is the model. Yeah, this is, again, these are criticisms that I think, even if MMT doesn't have a model, even if it hasn't been like thoroughly formalized, and even if the advocates of MMT have perhaps not done the best job in the world to convince the skeptics, which I also think is partly due to the insane criticism that they get. You have to at least be receptive to some of the criticism that they have of standard macro models, which I do think really put a dent into the standard views of what people think and what is taught in textbooks. And I will give you another example of in every single economics textbook, you will read that money is created by deposits in banks from households that save money, and by the central bank setting reserve requirements on banks, which then allows banks to loan money. That money that was originally deposited in them from household savings. Well, a 2014 Bank of England paper, which proved to be quite groundbreaking at the time, said all this was bullshit. That in fact, banks create money themselves by loaning. So basically, it's the other way around. It's not that banks loan money because households save and deposit money in banks, and then banks take that money and loan in proportion to what they're allowed to loan because the central bank determines reserve requirements. No, 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 no. Money is actually created by the banks themselves through the act of loaning. You basically, it's the chicken and an egg that the textbooks got wrong. So all these things are, I think, criticisms that should be taken seriously. And again, you don't have to be. I don't want anyone who watched this video, which has been a bit of a ramble, I must confess, but then this is what happens when I speak about economics. Anyone who watches this video shouldn't just jump on the MMT bandwagon. Like I said, I'm not on the MMT bandwagon, but I do think that it deserves far more respect than what idiots like Lawrence Summers, who have basically gotten everything wrong throughout their fucking careers, or idiots like Noah Smith, who basically just say what people want to hear and have no fundamental critique, except very, very marginalist critique of the orthodoxy. And by that, they're edgy. So that is why I do think that this freak out over MMT, the irrationality, the over emotion of the response towards MMT from the people who claim that the left is incredibly irrational and over emotional, just says everything you need to know about that. Like, I'm almost more inclined to take MMT seriously from the visceral reaction that I see from people like Summers or Noah Smith. But anyway, I will maintain my agnosticism towards MMT. But like I said, I remain sympathetic to much of its criticism. And on that note, this video ended up being way longer than I expected. But if you liked it, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.